transcendent, eternal, personal being of maximal greatness and maximal goodness, which defines and calls everything else into existence, which has purposes and intentions from eternity. Now, this being is by definition goodness and love, according to the theistic view. The claim is not that if you're a theist, you recognize moral truths, and if you're an atheist, you don't. The question is whether theism or atheism is a better metaphysical home for the knowledge we all have of moral truths. I would argue that it's clearly the theistic and not the atheistic perspective that most encompasses and accommodates this claim. Now let's turn to some scientific questions. There's a great essay by physicist Eugene Wigner called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Physical Sciences. What is discernible from the natural world? But I do think there's enough discernible from the public evidence that is available, from the direct introspection to which we all have access, and the best knowledge we have from the natural world, to conclude that there is something like a God. Observing is this strange sort of discovery that we made, especially in the physical sciences, that nature seems to be structured, at least in part of its aspects, according to mathematical formalities. This assumption that there's a rationality, a rational order that can in some sense be reduced to mathematics is not the sort of thing we had any reason to expect. Nevertheless, in the West, the founders of modern science, who did assume that, people like Kepler and Copernicus and Galileo, they assumed that the natural world was rational, that it made sense, that if they worked hard enough they could discover an underlying pattern, and that our minds could discern that underlying pattern. Now, why did they discover that? Why did they assume it as a statement of faith? They assumed it because they had a theistic worldview. They assumed the natural world was rational, that it was ordered, and that the human mind was constructed such that it could, if it worked hard enough, discern that order. Now, we know that the natural world is at least in part this way. The question is whether, if you're an atheist, you have any reason to expect this, or whether, if you're a theist, that reality makes more sense. We turn then to cosmology, and Mr. Hitchens has actually already summarized the Big Bang cosmology, the basic idea discovered in the 20th century that the universe had a beginning in the finite past. Several lines of evidence point in this direction. The redshift of the galaxies, as he mentioned, the cosmic background radiation discovered in the 60s, even the distribution of the different kinds of elements that we can observe. All of these point to a beginning of the present order in the finite past. Now imagine this. This wasn't a conspiracy concocted by a bunch of creationists in Kentucky. And in fact, when scientists first looked at Hubble's evidence of the redshift of the galaxies, they realized the implication that if the universe had a beginning, then no longer were we relieved of the question, where did it come from? Because in the 19th century, most scientists assumed the universe was eternal. We didn't have any evidence of the contrary. And yet Edwin Hubble discovered, unbeknownst to himself, evidence that the universe had a beginning, and which actually confirmed a prediction of Einstein's general theory of relativity. Now, why does this matter? I think you know intuitively why it matters. Because anything that begins to exist must have a cause for its existence. Now, you could always deny that premise if you didn't know if the universe had a beginning. But now we know the universe did begin to exist. And so it forces upon us the question, what is the cause of its existence? Unless you're willing to countenance that something can simply come from nothing, or that the universe bootstrapped itself into existence, then you're faced directly in the science of cosmology with the question of what caused the universe. And you want an adequate explanation, you're going to want a cause that transcends the physical universe and that at least has the capacity to bring it into existence. Now, as Mr. Hitchens mentioned, that simply begins the question. But we discover it in the universe that it not only had a beginning in the finite past, but that it conforms to very specific properties of which are called the fine-tuning problem. Starting in the 1960s, physicists discovered that when you look at the various laws and constants in physics, things like the electromagnetic force, the gravitational force, and the speed of light, it turns out that all these things rest, as it were, on a razor's edge. That if they were slightly different, if gravity were slightly weaker or slightly stronger than it actually is, the universe, or a universe compatible with complex life, would not be so much as possible. Now, we know that a universe with life is much more intrinsically interesting than a universe without life. And so again, it asks the question, if the universe looks fine-tuned for complex life, was it perhaps fine-tuned? But even in a fine-tuned universe like this, you still have a number of local conditions that have to be met to be able to build a single habitable planet. Now, Mr. Hitchens is right that in a very large universe with something like 10 to the 22 stars in the observable universe, it might be that you get just enough chances. Maybe you'll get one habitable planet like the Earth just by chance. Maybe we're the lucky recipients of some grand cosmic lottery. But as Guillermo Gonzalez and I argue in The Privileged Planet, there's actually another set of evidence that we think points to conspiracy rather than mere coincidence. What we've discovered when we've looked at the ingredients that you need to build a habitable planet is that those same conditions that make it possible for life to exist on a planet like the Earth, the kind of planet we have, the kind of atmosphere we have, which is transparent to light, our location in the galaxy, the type of sun we have, the weird coincidence that the sun and the moon match in their shapes and sizes in the sky to produce perfect solar eclipses. Those things were all important prerequisites for scientific discovery itself. So that we discovered that those rare places where life are in the universe are also the best places overall for scientific discovery. Now, this is just what you would expect if the universe itself were designed for discovery. It is not what you would expect if the universe is a blind concatenation of matter, space, time, and energy that exists for no purpose. Now, these are all evidences for design that exist prior to any debate in biology. Because once you have a habitable planet, of course, it's not as simple as just add water. You have to have the origin of life itself. Water is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for the existence of life. When you're talking about the origin of life, you're talking about the origin of biological information, the origin of the nanotechnology that we discover in the nanoscopic scale, the software and the hardware that we discover inside cells, that the 19th century scientists like Darwin knew nothing. Darwin assumed that at the cellular level we had nothing but simple homogeneous globules of protoplasm. And yet we discovered in the mid-20th century exquisite nanotechnology that exceeds any technology that humans have yet devised. That's a question that at least suggests design for an answer. Now, I certainly can't establish it here this afternoon. Then we turn to the history of life. And there we enter the controversial question of Darwinism, which unfortunately in the United States we can barely discuss in university settings without coming to blows. But the truth of the matter, and the question of the matter, is this. It's not whether Darwin's theory of evolution explains some things. In fact, the staunchest young Earth creationist openly admits and accepts that natural selection explains many things in the natural and the biological world. Natural selection clearly explains the survival of the fittest. It explains things like the variation in the thickness of beaks in the Galapagos Islands, for instance. The question is whether there are things in biology that are inaccessible to the Darwinian mechanism. Are there things that have to be constructed with all the parts in one time and place in order for their function to exist? Are there things, that is, that natural selection can't reach because there aren't any functional intermediates? That's an empirical question, and it's a question that biochemist Michael Behe opened in his book, Darwin's Black Box. The debate goes on, but Behe argues that there are many structures at the microscopic scale, especially in biochemistry, that are what he called irreducibly complex. And that doesn't mean really, really complicated. What it means is that there are certain structures in biology that have to have all their parts working and in place, the same time and place, in order for them to perform a function. That is, in order for them to provide an organism with a survival advantage. Natural selection doesn't have foresight. It selects for current survival advantage. It can't say, well, if I hold these 5 protein parts and eventually get 35 more, I'll eventually have a bacterial flagellum, or I'll eventually have a blood clotting cascade. Foresight is the exclusive jurisdiction of intelligent agency. And so when we discover structures in biology that suggest foresight and suggest that they are inaccessible to the Darwinian mechanism, we rightly raise the question of design. That's in biology. Now let's again return to introspection, because there are two things that each of us experiences directly, neither of which seems to be at home in an atheistic picture of the world. The first is consciousness. We all experience directly the fact that we are conscious, subjective agents. We experience first-person reality. And yet, if you look at many consistent materialist and atheistic philosophers like Daniel Dennett, they admit that the existence of consciousness in a purely material universe is an incomprehensible mystery. So that Dennett and many other atheistic philosophers finally have concluded that consciousness is an illusion. Now, any worldview that implies or concludes that you don't exist is perhaps a worldview you have a reason to doubt. And then finally, our own direct experience of freedom. We all take freedom for granted. We know what it feels like to act freely, to choose one thing rather than the other. We recognize when we're being coerced. We know when we're committed to an ideal and are able to pursue it against adversity. We experience freedom directly. And yet that freedom, which we know directly, makes very little sense in a materialistic and an atheistic universe. But if we are creatures